Diving into chapter 5. So, for lesson 5, we're going to be exploring 19th century England, still, Great Britain, I should say, and again, emphasis on free trade, but kind of its uniqueness to the British Empire. We'll also see how there's some great contrast brought up during this chapter between obvious signs of success, great wealth, major influence on the world, while opposite to that is a lot of devastation and catastrophes that went on in the empire at this time, and especially close to the homeland called the Great Famine. On one hand, we have this display right in the middle of the century, 1851, of the Great Exhibition, and that, even while it's being planned, which took several years to plan, there's a famine going on in Ireland, just right across the sea. And so it's a very interesting chapter. And as we look at the cause and effects of perspectives, and that all the while, these transformations that free trade was pushing towards. So let's dive in. Near the beginning of the chapter, or specifically, I was even thinking of page 151, where it highlights the fact that we'll see for the first time a global economic system. Credit to Great Britain for causing that and bringing that about during this era. But it's really the first time that we see a global economy interconnected the way it became. And it's the first time it had reached to that level of being interconnected. And there's good in that. And then we even saw some ripple effects of that. We'll even see the ripple effects related to Great Britain itself, and how that kind of backfired on it in some ways. More on that later. But to that point, Britain at this point became, the author calls it, the world workshop, and especially its financial center, transportation kind of hub, as well as even setting the standard for currency valuation at the time. All currencies based themselves on the values based upon the pound sterling, which is, again, central to why it had impacted the globe to that point. The gospel of free trade. So we've talked about multiple gospels. We had moral reformers we've talked in the past. We were talking about the gospel of self-help. Now elevating again free trade in its perspectives, but at one point were revolutionary thoughts. Were so pervasive by the end of the century that so many at the end of that century, or especially a younger person at the end of that century and moving into the 20th century, would have probably felt like this is the way it always had been. So the transformation had taken place that much upon its political and economic structure that this free trade, we're even calling it in this chapter now a gospel, as its message and all the aspects of society playing into that impact on the culture are pretty phenomenal. Keys to, I think it being considered a gospel, meaning that it had pervaded the opinion and culture so much, were tied into the fact that many saw it as a divine plan, something that came straight out of God's plan and the way things should be ran. Mixed with that too was it fostered or even continued discrimination and justification for discrimination, either by class or even by race. Unfortunately, that's intertwined in this gospel, a gospel that was very much connected to religious teaching as well, and evangelical worldview at the time. Also key to making this transition so culturally wide. Pay attention to the role of the Anti-Corn Law League. This league was one of the first ones to truly kind of formulate and especially broadcast the connection between free trade concepts and to the consumer. In past videos, past discussions, we've talked about the free trade concept being an advocate for at an individual kind of level of motivation and so forth, abstractly, but even theoretically and so forth. But here we have the Anti-Corn Law League. It really made this connection very clear and broadcasted that concept. And it was extremely important in where basically this whole free trade also was tied to a moral charge. And a birth of the movement then fostered additional pressure on Parliament with regards to representation. The Anti-Corn Law League, especially in connection with this gospel of free trade, is a huge deal. So I really want you guys to take note of that and recognize its importance. Not everybody was on board, though. We see even on page 156, 157, discussions that the author gives us and pointing to specific individuals or groups that were still not on board with those free trade concepts. So here we have, even in the middle of the century, 1849, he brought up Thomas Carlyle. This is a gentleman that's still defending slavery, and that the imperial economy, in his opinion, was more of a God-given hierarchical society and structure, and then he very much would have distrusted concepts of hands-off, the laissez-faire. In addition to that, people, the Tories, one of the parties and controlling parties at the time, very much enjoying the status quo. A lot of them involved with prestige and positions and wealth and enjoying how the economy had been going. Also still saw that there was more of a natural order, they thought, and especially a hierarchy, in the imperial system compared to a free trade system. Kind of opposite, saying the exact same argument, but from the exact opposite point of view. Another one that's kind of interesting too, that they would argue or would have contested for, is that they believe that the free trade concept caused new division within the society that hadn't really happened before. If you have a structured society and everybody played their role and knew what the role was, and then try to change those roles, well, now these concepts and these theories that are becoming pervasive, in their opinion, would be pitting rich versus poor, rural people versus urban city, as they all took up different perspectives and issues. So in some ways, they could have argued that it was that the free trade gospel could have even played a role in polarizing the society or elements of the society. So I thought that was interesting things to note. I mentioned in the very beginning here, we have these two great events, Great Famine and Great Exhibition. Focusing on the Great Famine, pages 159 up through even 163 is another highlight, and we'll get to it in a second here. Focuses on the Great Famine. Now, me being from Irish descent, hey, this is kind of important to me. Well, if we look from the American side of it, there's times where certain people groups came in droves to the United States. Well, one of those people groups was the Irish, and that was in the 1840s. And often here, from the American perspective, you will hear it called the potato famine, or the word potato involved in it, because the Great Famine that happened had to do with the Irish people's maybe a little bit overemphasis or over dependency on the potatoes as a staple to the diet, etc. So then when plight hit the potato crops, it wreaked havoc, on the Irish people and the land of Ireland. It was really devastating. And this happened between 1841 and through 1845. And it came in contrast to all the major hubbub that was going on and that the Free Trade Society was taking claim to, the successes and the advances in the open markets, even would have tied into industrialization and mechanization, competitive markets, all these things that have created so much wealth for certain people that then became on display at the Great Exhibition. It's just ironic that right across the ocean, like I was saying earlier, or right across the sea, is a member of their state. This is not just a colony. Okay? This is a member of the nation state. Remember the acts of union of 1800 that made Ireland one of its members. So this is not just a distant colony. This is not just a backwards people only in the sense of that you just conquered them. I mean, this is supposed to be part of the integral part of the society when it comes to Great Britain. But at the same time, it was treated like that. And we see that 1 million Irish people lost their lives. Another 2 million emigrated, out of Ireland to other parts, many of them to the United States at the time and other parts. But we also see the irony of this gospel and tied into evangelical views, where instead of having pity or compassion, let's say, on the Irish situation, many saw this as the free trade system, the self-help system, punishing a group of people, as they would have, with even prejudice, considered them backwards, primitive, unruly, unable to self-govern. So instead of compassion, they even justified all the more that actually you guys are being punished for being backwards, and maybe even consider them immoral. You'll see that special write-up on page 163 that really highlights the fact that people that were charged with even trying to help in this situation still had a racism, a prejudice about their processes and their perspectives, even if they were trying to help. They kind of considered the Irish people a bit subhuman. And another thing the article pointed out to is that the epidemic that happened here was exacerbated by vicious legislation, were the two words that I talked about. Again, all the legislation that had to do with those in power and in controlling, even with potential good change, whether it be politics or it be in the economic system, those changes were made in such a way, though, that it came at the expense of the agriculture industry. It came at the expense of the laboring class. It came at the expense of entire groups, like the Irish over here, just off the coast, so to speak, from the mainland. So it really also shows us why some people visiting England during this time, though they would have been awed in some ways about the good things that Great Britain had been accomplishing, they also would have been appalled about the irony that was going on at the same time. The Great Exhibition itself of 1851, as the book even talked about, obviously was pulled off with lots of pomp and circumstance. The Queen Victoria, there's even the image that he provided in the book, her and her entourage and all that, as a part of the opening to this big, huge event. I was trying to remember the numbers. It said over 6 million people eventually had come through and visited this great exhibition. It highlighted mechanization, it highlighted refined goods, all the raw materials that the British Empire had access to. But it also did not talk about some of the main ingredients that have caused or enabled this great success, like the laboring class. The book points that out, I think, very well, that those that were really probably even most foundational to all the success were unrepresented at this great exhibition. That was good to note as well. Let's talk a little bit about this new global economic order again. I had mentioned before, and the book had talked about this on page 167, that never before had the global economy been so interconnected. So let me just ask a quick question here to us, Americans anyway. What happened in 1860s in the United States? Well, it was our great Civil War. right? And so why is that significant to all of a sudden say that? Well, we see this interconnectedness having negative ripple effects on Great Britain because of the Civil War, and then the things that the blockades and some of the things that the Union forces did under President Lincoln, that it really put a damper on the cotton raw materials that Great Britain had become so dependent on coming out of the United States. I mean, it's a major comment in this book as far as the impact it had on Great Britain as another example of its interconnected economy. Also, he then even mentions the Great Depression. The Great Depression, not the one that we think of the United States in the 1930s, 1940s, 1929 to 1930s especially anyway, but the Great Depression of 1873, yeah, I was going to say 37, so that's not right, 1873, where again, because of a lot of British investments that had been in different places of Europe and some in the United States, and when some of those started going bad, all this ripple effect in ways that Great Britain had not experienced before. But at the same time, it had built such a presence, in its empire with its colonies, its protectorates, its dominions, that in some ways, too, it was able to even retreat and just kind of focus within, almost create this little inner economy that kept its economy a bit maybe insulated at times, but the bigger grand scheme of things, it was much more impacted by things happening around the world that it had before. So it had expanded greatly and is touting all the successes of that interconnectedness, those trade networks and so forth. But then at other times we see it being impacted by all those connections. The heavy industry comes online in these discussions. It's like the second phase of the Industrial Revolution. I like to point out that it almost reaffirms the fact, like we talked about, that the real first phase, the first industrial revolution, happened in the textile industries. Here, the second phase is talked about when it comes to steel and iron and so forth. And so it puts that chronology there in place. It had happened, this next phase, the second phase, and especially with the output represented by Great Britain, was huge. He even talks very specifically about certain stats, right? For like 1860s, he said that 53% of the world's iron was being produced by Great Britain. Think how small in size, demographically or geographically this nation is, and yet it's producing 53% of the world's iron, and at the same time then was also the world's largest steel producer. That came during this discussion. And then lastly, just talk about urbanization. Some of our questions covers some of those things that we talked about, but also one of them dives into the urbanization. Another first that we see attributed to Great Britain is it being able to claim that it was the first to have a true urban society, that it reached in some of its cities such a level that it owns that spot as being the first to have an urbanization to this degree. He points to London, even the growth of London, even by 1881, the population of London was so big that if you combine Paris and Tokyo and what else was Mexico City and Beijing, I think there was another one in there. Anyway, you combine all those, and London was still bigger than that in 1881. That's a big city, And we discussed in some of the questions, kind of how did that happen? What led to this change from a rural society, especially as we open up the 19th century? 80% of the people, 80% of the population are still living in a rural setting. What an amazing flop, where that exact same number, 80%, is now associated with those living in an urban setting just 100 years later. quite a bit of change in a small amount of time. One of the discussion questions addresses that as well. Let me review my notes on some of my discussion questions, highlighting some of the things that I think are important. When we talk about the first question, religion, and how did it inform ideas of the liberal economy, just see the connection, how a century before, religion was a catalyst to even enlightenment. Now we are looking at the religion's role into informing, affirming these gospels of free trade and so forth. And so we see that religion, once again, plays a really important role. And there's good in that, and there's actually definitely some negative in that, and what I would think you guys would discover. The second question, we're relating to discussing the contrast again between the Great Exhibition and the Irish Famine, and the lessons. Some of these lessons that refers to may not be lessons that were learned like oops, and maybe lessons that they could have been taken as, in my opinion, maybe a grievous way of looking at it. For example, if they're going to look at this new gospel of free trade and how it rewards those who are morally upright, etc., to the point where then they would have a real negative view towards what happened in the Great Famine in Ireland, and they're seeing it as a punishment of, I don't know if that would be really learning much of a lesson per se. So some of what I'm taking this question is, it doesn't necessarily mean that they learn something from it, but it could be the views, as you're comparing both these together. It'll be interesting to see what you guys come up with. Lastly, the third question does talk about, what kind of brought on Britain becoming a predominantly urban society. Look forward to seeing those responses.